I meet people all the time who tell me, Mr. Rohn, I'm so lonely being single. And I always tell them the same thing. Let me teach you something that's worth far more than any relationship. Let me teach you about the power of living alone. Now, here's the thing about living alone, it's a choice. Isn't that interesting? Being in a relationship often happens by chance, but choosing to live alone, that's a deliberate decision. And I'm going to tell you why it's one of the most powerful decisions you can make. Let me share something with you that my mentor, Mr. Schofab, taught me years ago. He said, Jim, don't wish for better relationships. Wish for better understanding of yourself. And you know where you find that understanding? In solitude. Not in relationships. In solitude. You see, people in relationships often think they're at the top of life's game. But people who live alone, they're playing a different game entirely. And here's why. Relationships are about compromise. But living alone is about conviction. Let me tell you something interesting about living alone. It's the bridge between dependence and independence. Anybody can be in a relationship. Most people are. But living alone, that takes courage, character, and conviction. Here's what's fascinating about living alone. It works while relationships sleep. Isn't that interesting? A person in a relationship might work on themselves occasionally, but a person who lives alone, they're growing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They don't take breaks. They don't make excuses. They don't wait for someone else's approval. Now, let me share with you the 5 major pieces of the living alone puzzle. First, it starts with self-sufficiency. You know what's interesting? Most people don't even try for that. They're always looking for someone to complete them. The person who lives alone, they complete themselves. Number 2, they develop self-awareness. Isn't that fascinating? While people in relationships are trying to understand their partners, people who live alone are mastering the most important relationship of all, the one with themselves. Number 3, they create their own happiness. Now, here's what's interesting about happiness. People in relationships often depend on others for it. But people who live alone, they generate their own joy, their own peace, their own fulfillment. Number 4, they make decisions based on their own values, not someone else's compromise. That's fascinating, isn't it? Relationships require constant negotiation, living alone. It requires constant conviction. And number 5, they develop at their own pace without having to sync with someone else's timeline. You see, relationships often force you to move at someone else's speed, but living alone, you move at exactly the right pace for you. Let me tell you a story about 2 gardens. One garden was shared between 2 people. They constantly argued about what to plant, when to water, how to tend it. The other garden, it belonged to one person who lived alone. You know what happened? The shared garden was a mess of compromises, but the solo garden, it was a perfect reflection of one person's vision. Here's what's fascinating about living alone at compounds. Isn't that interesting? Every skill you develop, every decision you make, every habit you build, it's all yours. No dilution, no compromise, no negotiation. Let me share with you the mathematics of living alone. If you invest in yourself just 1% more every day, at the end of 1 year, you'll be 37 times better. Not 365% better, 37 times better. That's the power of diluted personal growth. Now, here's what's interesting about people in relationships. They often resist living alone because they're afraid of solitude. Isn't that fascinating? The very thing they need most is the thing they fear most. But here's the reality. The marketplace doesn't care about your relationship status. The marketplace only cares about what you deliver. And people who live alone, they often deliver more because they have more time, more focus, and more energy. Let me tell you about 2 kinds of peace. There's the peace of compromise and the peace of conviction. The peace of compromise comes and goes with the relationship. The peace of conviction, it stays with you because it comes from within. You know what else is interesting about living alone? It's the great clarifier. Relationships often cloud our judgment. We start seeing things through someone else's eyes. But living alone, you see things exactly as they are. Let me share with you the 7 benefits that make living alone better than any relationship. First, there's freedom of choice. You know what's fascinating about choice? In relationships, it's always negotiated. But when you live alone, every choice is yours to make. Second, there's financial independence. Now, here's what's interesting about money in relationships. It's often a source of conflict. But when you live alone, you control every penny, every investment, every financial decision. Third, there's personal growth. Relationships can actually stunt growth because we often stay comfortable for our partner's sake. But living alone, there's no limit to how much you can grow, change, and evolve. Fourth, there's time management. Isn't it interesting how relationships consume time? But when you live alone, every minute is yours to invest as you see fit. Fifth, there's emotional stability. You know what's fascinating about emotions? In relationships, they're often influenced by someone else's moods. But when you live alone, your emotional state is entirely your own to manage. Sixth, there's career focus. Now here's what's interesting about careers. Relationships often require compromise in professional choices. But when you live alone, your career path can be as ambitious as you want it to be. And seventh, there's personal space. Isn't that fascinating? In relationships, space is always negotiated. But when you live alone, all space is your space, physically and mentally. Let me tell you something interesting about these 7 benefits. They work whether you're an introvert or an extrovert. Isn't that fascinating? Living alone isn't about being antisocial. It's about being self-sufficient. Here's what else is fascinating about living alone. It creates its own support system. People in relationships often rely solely on their partner, but people who live alone, they build diverse, rich networks of friends, colleagues, and mentors. Let me share with you the 3 enemies of successful solo living. First, there's societal pressure. You know what's interesting about society? It's still caught up in the notion that everyone needs a partner. But that's just not true anymore. Second, there's self-doubt. Now here's what's fascinating about self-doubt. It's often loudest when we're doing exactly what we should be doing. The voice that says you need someone is usually just fear talking. And third, there's the comparison trap. Isn't it interesting how we sometimes compare our solo lives to other people's highlight reels of their relationships? But here's the truth. You never know what goes on behind closed doors. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and success. People in relationships often have to compromise their definition of success. But people who live alone, they get to define success entirely on their own terms. You know what else is fascinating about living alone? It's predictable. Relationships can be chaotic. You never know what your partner will be in, what crisis might arise. But living alone, you create your own atmosphere. Let me share with you the 4 seasons of living alone. First, there's the season of adjustment, learning to be comfortable in your own company. Second, there's the season of growth, developing your own routines and rhythms. Third, there's the season of mastery, becoming exceptionally good at managing your life. And fourth, there's the season of fulfillment, experiencing the deep satisfaction of complete self-sufficiency. Now, here's what's interesting about these seasons. People in relationships often try to skip them. But people who live alone, they understand that each season has its own lessons, its own challenges, and its own rewards. Let me tell you about the miracle of living alone. You know what's fascinating about miracles? Most people wait for someone else to create them, but people who live alone, they create their own miracles through self-reliance and personal growth. Here's what else is interesting about living alone. It's transparent. Relationships can hide our weaknesses, mask our flaws. But living alone, it shows us exactly who we are, what we're capable of, and what we need to improve. Let me share with you the 5 laws of successful solo living. First, there's the law of self-sufficiency. The more you depend on yourself, the more reliable your life becomes. Second, there's the law of personal space. Every square foot of your living space reflects your choices, your taste, your personality. Isn't that fascinating? There's no need to compromise on design, decoration, or organization. Third, there's the law of time freedom. Living alone gives you complete control over your schedule. You know what's interesting about time? In relationships, it's always shared. But when you live alone, every minute is yours to invest as you choose. Fourth, there's the law of financial independence. Now, here's what's fascinating about money. When you live alone, every financial decision is yours to make. No joint accounts, no shared expenses, no financial compromises. And fifth, there's the law of personal growth. Isn't it interesting how relationships can sometimes hold us back? But when you live alone, there's no limit to how much you can grow, learn, and evolve. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and personal development. People in relationships often grow at a compromised pace. They have to consider their partner's comfort zone. But people who live alone, they can grow as fast and as far as they want. Here's what's fascinating about personal development. It accelerates when you're alone. Why? Because all your energy goes into your own growth, not into maintaining a relationship. Let me share with you the 6 qualities of successful solo livers. First, they're self-reliant. You know what's interesting about self-reliance? It's not about doing everything yourself. It's about being in charge of getting everything done. Second, they're decisive. Now, here's what's fascinating about decisions. When you live alone, you make them faster because you don't need anyone else's input or approval. Third, they're resourceful. Isn't it interesting how living alone develops your problem-solving skills? When there's no one else to rely on, you become amazingly creative in handling challenges. Fourth, they're self-aware. You know what's fascinating about self-awareness? It grows exponentially when you're not distracted by relationship dynamics. Fifth, they're disciplined. Now, here's what's interesting about discipline. It's easier to maintain when you're not adapting to someone else's habits or routines. And sixth, their content. Isn't that fascinating? While many people fear being alone will make them lonely, those who master solo living often find deep, lasting contentment. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and opportunity. People in relationships often have to pass up opportunities because they don't fit with their partner's plans. But people who live alone, they can say yes to any opportunity that aligns with their goals. Here's what else is fascinating about living alone. It's efficient. Relationships require lots of time and energy for maintenance. But living alone, all that energy can go into pursuing your dreams and goals. Let me share with you the 4 freedoms of living alone. First, there's the freedom of schedule. You know what's interesting about schedules in relationships? They're always compromised. But when you live alone, your time is truly your own. Second, there's the freedom of space. Now, here's what's fascinating about space in relationships. It's always shared, always negotiated. But when you live alone, every corner of your space reflects your preferences. Third, there's the freedom of choice. Isn't it interesting how relationships require constant negotiation about even small decisions? But when you live alone, every choice is yours to make. And fourth, there's the freedom of growth. You know what's fascinating about personal growth? It's often stunted in relationships because we tend to maintain the status quo for our partner's comfort. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and goals. People in relationships often have to modify their goals to accommodate their partner's dreams. But people who live alone, they can pursue their goals with single-minded focus. Here's what's interesting about goals. They're achieved faster when you don't have to negotiate every step of the way with a partner. Let me share with you the 5 truths about living alone. First, it's a choice. You know what's fascinating about choices? They reveal your priorities. Second, it's a skill. Now, here's what's interesting about skills. They improve with practice. The longer you live alone, the better you get at it. Third, it's a strategy. Isn't that fascinating? While others are seeking partnerships, you're building self-reliance. Fourth, it's a lifestyle. You know what's interesting about lifestyles? They're not about what you're missing, they're about what you're choosing. And fifth, it's a strength. Now, here's what's fascinating about strength. It's not about being able to lift heavy things. It's about being able to carry yourself through life. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and leadership. People in relationships often have divided focus. Part of their energy goes to maintaining the relationship. But people who live alone, they can dedicate all their energy to leading and achieving. Here's what else is interesting about living alone. It builds character. Every challenge you face on your own terms. Every solution you find is your own solution. Let me share with you the 3 promises of living alone. First, it promises growth. You know what's fascinating about growth? It's fastest when there's no one holding you back. Second, it promises peace. Now, here's what's interesting about peace. It's deeper when it comes from within rather than from a relationship. And third, it promises fulfillment. Isn't that fascinating? While others seek fulfillment in relationships, you find it in self-actualization. Let me tell you about the relationship between living alone and time management. People in relationships often have to coordinate their schedules with their partner. But people who live alone, they own their time completely. Here's what's fascinating about time management. It's not about having more time. It's about having complete control over the time you have. Let me share with you the 4 rewards of living alone. First, there's the reward of self-knowledge. You know what's interesting about self-knowledge? It's clearest when there's no one else's personality clouding the mirror. Second, there's the reward of achievement. Now, here's what's fascinating about achievement. It's often faster when you don't have to compromise your methods or pace. Third, there's the reward of peace. Isn't it interesting how much quieter life is when you're not managing relationship dynamics? And fourth, there's the reward of freedom. You know what's fascinating about freedom? It's not just about doing what you want. It's about becoming who you truly are. Let me tell you something else about living alone. It's the ultimate form of self-trust. When you choose to live alone, you're choosing to bet on yourself instead of depending on someone else. Here's what's interesting about self-trust. It grows stronger with every challenge you handle on your own. Isn't that fascinating? The very things that might scare others away from living alone are the things that make you stronger. Let me share with you the final truth about living alone. It's the highest form of self-actualization. You know why? Because when you live alone, you're choosing to become your complete self rather than someone's better half. And that, my friends, is why living alone beats any relationship. Not sometimes, not occasionally, but consistently. Because relationships are about compromise, but living alone is about completion. Relationships are about sharing space, but living alone is about owning your space. Relationships are about negotiation, but living alone is about conviction. Remember this, life doesn't respond to relationships. Life responds to individuals. The marketplace doesn't reward couples. The marketplace rewards performance. And performance isn't about who you're with, it's about who you are. So let me ask you, what will you do with this message? Will you continue to search for the perfect relationship? Or will you begin to perfect your relationship with yourself? The choice is yours, but the consequences belong to everyone you could have become without compromise. Choose living alone. Choose it today. Choose it tomorrow. Choose it every day for the rest of your life. Because living alone beats any relationship. Not because it's easy, but because it's worth it. That's the message I want to leave with you today. Not because it's popular, but because it's true. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's necessary. Not because it's what you wanted to hear, but because it's what you needed to hear. Remember, living alone beats any relationship, every single time. And that's worth thinking about, isn't it?